The 1960s in America marked the height of the counterculture movement and the dawn of the free love era. This period saw a surge in self-exploration and the rise of the hippie movement. Against this backdrop of love, acceptance and peace, one man would create one of the world's most infamous and well-known cults. The Family of Charles Manson. Charles Miles Manson was born in Ohio in 1934 to Ada Kathleen Maddox, a teenage mother and a father who was locally described as a con artist. His father had deceived Ada by claiming to be a colonel in the army, but it turned out that colonel was just his first name and he was actually a mill worker. When Ada became pregnant, he once again lied, claiming that he had been called away on army business and never returned, leaving Manson without the chance to meet his father. Kathleen Maddox was born in 1919 in Kentucky and was the youngest of her siblings. She had 2 sisters and 1 brother. Raised in a deeply religious household, she rebelled against her parents' strict Christian lifestyle during her teenage years. Her parents forbid her from wearing skirts, associating with boys, or having fun, and she was mocked for wanting long hair. Kathleen's grandmother was even more religious and fanatical, intensifying the pressures put upon her by her parents. At just 15 years old, Kathleen ran away from home in 1933. A year later, she would give birth to Charles Manson. Charles Manson's name initially appeared as Maddox on his birth certificate. However, after his mother Kathleen met a man by the name of William Manson, she gave her son the last name Manson. Unfortunately, their relationship soured and the couple eventually split. In interviews, Manson claimed he had no recollection of the man whose name he now bore. Manson's description of his mother were unflattering. He portrayed her as a prostitute and a thief who had numerous failed relationships. In 1939, Kathleen was arrested for assault and robbery with a sentence of 5 years. However, Manson narrowly avoided foster care and instead was sent to live with his caring aunt and uncle. Like his maternal family, they were strict and tried to keep the young Manson in line. Despite this, he followed in his mother's footsteps, developing a rebellious streak, continuously seeking trouble. After his mother's release from prison, they reunited and embarked on a series of moves from motel to motel. Manson later described this period as the happiest time in his life. Nevertheless, he continued his rebellious behaviour, leading to a teenage life marked by incarceration and encounters with the law. Along with truancy and petty theft, this led to repeated trouble by age 13, and due to a lack of available foster housing, he was sent to Gilbert School for Boys, an all-boys boarding school for male delinquents, run by Catholic priests. The school was strict, administering harsh punishments such as beatings with leather belts for minor infractions. Manson would escape the school and find shelter in the woods until he could return home to his mother. However, she eventually returned him to Gilbert, prompting Manson to run away again, this time to Indianapolis. In 1948, Manson committed his first documented crime by stealing money from a grocery store. He used the stolen funds to secure food and rent an apartment on Skid Row. After the robbery, Manson attempted to lead an honest life and found work delivering messages for Western Union. However, he eventually returned to a life of crime in pursuit of additional income. In 1949, he was caught stealing once again. However, the sympathetic judge decided to send Manson to Boys Town, a juvenile center in Nebraska. However, after only 4 days, Manson and fellow inmate Blackie Nielsen obtained a gun and stole a car. They went on to commit 2 armed robberies while heading to Nielsen's uncle's house, who happened to be a professional thief. After arriving, Nielsen's uncle took them on as his apprentices. However, Manson was soon arrested during a late-night raid on the store. This led to Manson being linked to the 2 armed robberies he had committed previously. Once again, he was sent to a strict reform school just outside Indianapolis. The school proved to be a hellish experience for Manson. He alleged that he was raped by other students, with the staff either encouraging this act or beating him repeatedly. Manson attempted to escape from the school a staggering 18 times. It was during his time there that Manson created his own defense technique, which he called the insane game. In this strategy, Manson would flail his arms, act erratic, pull faces, and scream to convince attackers that he was insane. Eventually, Manson escaped with 2 other boys in 1951. The trio would go on to rob petrol stations as they travelled across California in a stolen car. However, they were later arrested in Utah. Once again, Manson found himself in a school for delinquent boys. Upon arrival, he underwent a series of tests to assess his literacy rate. Although deemed illiterate, Manson had an above-average IQ of 109. His caseworker also described him as aggressively antisocial. Later, in 1951, Manson was transferred to a low-security institution in Virginia on the recommendations of a psychotherapist. His aunt visited him there and assured the administrators that Manson could stay with them offering to help find him work. However, just a year later, in February 1952, Manson faced a parole hearing. In January of the same year, he was caught raping a boy at knife point. A homosexual in the 1950s, Manson faced social rejection. His criminal record continued to grow, with 8 serious disciplinary offences, 3 of which involved homosexual acts. Later, Manson was moved to a maximum security reformatory in Ohio, where he was meant to remain until his 21st birthday in 1955. However, he was released early and went to live with his aunt and uncle in West Virginia. A year later, in 1955, Charles Manson married Rosalie Jean Willis, a 15-year-old hospital waitress. Their seemingly traditional life took a dark turn when Manson was charged with stealing a car and transporting it across state lines. Despite being given 5 years probation, Manson failed to appear for a similar hearing in Florida, leading to his arrest in 1956. He was subsequently sentenced to 3 years in a Los Angeles prison. While Manson was in prison, his wife gave birth to their child, named Charles Manson Jr. During his final years behind bars, Manson received regular visits from Rosie and his mother, who had relocated to Los Angeles. However, when Rosie ceased her visits, Manson's mother informed him that Rosie was now living with another man. Frustrated and desperate, Manson attempted to escape by stealing a car. This incident occurred just 2 weeks before a parole hearing, and as a result, Manson was given 5 years of probation, with his parole request denied. In September, a year later, Manson issued Rosie with a divorce notice and received 5 years parole. By November, Manson had begun pimping a 16-year-old girl. He was also receiving additional financial support from a woman with wealthy parents. In September of the following year, 1959, Manson pled guilty to attempting to cash a forged US Treasury check that was allegedly stolen from a letterbox. However, after a woman named Leona Ray Stephen made a tearful plea to the court, stating that they were madly in love and would marry if Manson was freed, he received a 10-year suspended sentence. Before the end of the year, Manson and Stevens were married. Manson was later held for questioning after violating the Manns Act, a set of US laws prohibiting the transportation of women and girls for the purpose of prostitution. He had taken Stephen and another woman to New Mexico for this purpose. Suspecting he was still under investigation, Manson attempted to go into hiding. He was later arrested in Texas and returned to Los Angeles, after an indictment was issued in 1960. Manson was ordered to serve his suspended sentence and was sent to prison. It was here, after being transferred in 1961, that he began to take guitar lessons through an inmate. He obtained the contact information of a producer at Universal Studios named Phil Kaufman. While Manson was in prison, it was noted that he had a strong desire to draw attention to himself. In 1963, Stevens filed for divorce from Manson. Later, in 1967, Manson was released, having spent more than half his life behind bars. Remarkably, Manson requested to remain in prison as he preferred it to the outside world. 1960s America was a time of growing anti-establishment movements and a wider move towards the acceptance of different peoples, identities, sexualities, and rights of people of colour and women. This led to the Voters' Reform Act of 1965, along with an increased use in drugs. People were becoming disillusioned with the government and traditional values, leading to a reimagining of the American dream. The younger people at the time were becoming opposed to the Vietnam War and rebelling against this with peaceful protests, emphasizing peace, love, acceptance, and communal living with a strong rejection towards capitalism. Along with their recognizable colorful clothing and long hair, hippies were a far cry from the 1950s fashion and lifestyle. As the hippie movement grew, so did the popularity of artists such as Hendrix, the Beatles, and Bob Dylan. During this time, a lot of young people were searching for their true selves, and this profound shift in American culture would be what Manson would prey upon to create what is now known as the Family. After his release from prison in 1967, Manson moved to San Francisco. Upon arrival, he avoided a probation violation by contacting the probation office. He was then assigned to the office of Roger Smith, a doctor of criminology, who would supervise him. Until 1986, Smith worked at the Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which Manson frequently visited. It's alleged that during Smith's tenure at the clinic, they received CIA funding to study the effects of drugs on the local counterculture movement. The drugs tested on the members included LSD and methamphetamine, which Manson and his followers regularly used after visiting the clinic. During this period, Manson frequently used drugs, and researchers noted that the change in his personality was the most abrupt they'd ever seen in their entire careers. Inspired by the free love movement and Summer of Love, Manson read Stranger in a Strange Land, a sci-fi novel about a human who comes to Earth from Mars and integrates into human society. This inspired him to start preaching his philosophy. Although his philosophy was not unique, like most cults, it was a mixture of various influences, including the Bible, Stranger in a Strange Land, Scientology, the Beatles, and the works of American writer Dale Carnegie. This preaching began to gain Manson a following. While Manson was incarcerated, he began to study Scientology and completed 150 hours of auditing. However, in 1966, he had ceased practicing the religion. It was during this time that he met his right-hand man, Bruce Davies, who was also working at the Church of Scientology at the time. When Manson first moved to San Francisco, he met a young woman named Mary Bruner, who was working at the University of California, Berkeley. At the time, Manson was making his money through begging, and perhaps out of pity, Bruner allowed him to move in with her. Shortly after, he encountered a runaway teenager named Lynette Froome, nicknamed Squeaky, and persuaded her to live with them. Although Bruner was understandably unhappy with this arrangement, Manson managed to convince her to let the girl stay. Over time, their home became shared with 18 other women. Manson's targets were often individuals with emotional insecurities, and those considered social outcasts, as they were easy for him to manipulate. During the summer of love and the rise of the hippie culture, Charles Manson established himself as a guru, attracting a following primarily consisting of women. Manson taught his followers that they were the reincarnation of the original Christians and would be persecuted by the establishment, which he referred to as the Romans. This led to the belief that the establishment would victimize them, just as they had done with early Christians. Bruner became pregnant in 1967, and on the 15th of April 1968, she gave birth to her and Manson's child. At the time, they were living in a condemned house. In the book Love Needs Care, written by Dr. David Smith, who was studying the effects of drugs on Charles Manson, he claimed that Manson attempted to reprogram his followers to be totally submissive to him and his will. Paul Watkins, a member of the Manson family, testified that Manson would have the group use LSD, or he took a lower dosage to keep his wits about him. Paul later said, Manson's trip was to program us all to submit. By the end of April 1968, Manson had attracted 20 followers, all under the supervision of Roger Smith. Roger Smith worked at Haight-Ashbury Free Medical Clinic, which, as mentioned before, possibly had ties to the CIA. This makes me wonder, did they ever report what Manson was doing to the CIA? And why did they just stand and watch a cult be formed? But I suspect these questions we can't get answers to. Manson expanded his cult through the use of drugs and prostitution, all under the watchful eye of Roger Smith, and without interference from the police. However, on the 31st of July, 1968, Manson was arrested for attempting to prevent the arrest of one of his followers. Instead of being sent to prison, he was given an additional 3 years of probation. In 1968, Manson once again avoided arrest after crashing the bus they used to transport the family into a ditch. He was found by the police asleep and naked, but was later released with only a drug charge. In April of 1968, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys picked up some hitchhikers who turned out to be members of the Manson family. He dropped them off at their destination, but a few days later he encountered the same women again. This time, he took them to his home, where they discussed the guru that they were involved with. The woman mentioned Charles Manson, explaining that he had recently been released from prison after serving 12 years. Following this conversation, Dennis went to a recording session. Upon his return, he found Manson standing in his driveway. When he entered his home, he discovered a dozen of Manson's followers, mostly young women, inside. Manson claimed that he had previously met Dennis at a friend's house when he was buying weed, and that Dennis had invited him to visit when he arrived in LA. However, this was only Manson's claim. In a magazine interview, Dennis referred to Manson as the Wizard, and was initially captivated by Manson and his growing following. The two soon became friends, and for a few months, members of the Manson family, mostly women, who were treated as servants, lived at Dennis's home. This arrangement lasted for 6 months until a member of the family destroyed 2 of Dennis's luxury cars. Following this incident, Dennis distanced himself from Manson and moved to a different part of Los Angeles. The family remained in the house until they were later evicted a few weeks before the lease ended, stealing almost all of Dennis's belongings. Manson attempted to maintain contact with Dennis, leaving a bullet with his housekeeper along with a threatening message. But during the time Dennis and Manson were friends, Manson would be introduced to a few people working in the music industry, and Manson would even record some songs at one of their home studios. Manson would write a song for the Beach Boys, whose title later became Never Learn Not to Love, and was released in December of 1968. However, Manson was not credited with the writing of the song, and only Dennis was. Dennis claimed Manson wasn't credited because he gave up his publishing rights after getting $100,000 worth of items from Dennis. This may have been the cause of why the family destroyed the cars. A representative of the Beach Boys recording label mentioned that Dennis had grown increasingly worried about Manson's escalated drug use, particularly his heavy consumption of acid. This concern led Dennis to ask Manson to leave, but it was a challenging situation as Dennis was afraid of him. After Manson was expelled from Dennis's old house, he relocated the family to a dilapidated ranch known as Span Ranch. This ranch had previously been used as a movie and filming location, but was now primarily generating revenue through horse rides. The female members of the family took on chores and managed the upkeep of the ranch. However, Manson also coerced his followers to have sex with the owner of the ranch, an 80-year-old blind man named George Span. The woman became his guides, and in return, the family was allowed to stay at the ranch for free. By this time, Manson's teachings had escalated to full doomsday cult level. He was convinced that a race war would soon erupt between the black and the white population of the United States. Manson preached that black people would rise up and kill the white people in the USA, except him and his followers. He believed that the black population wouldn't be intelligent enough to thrive on their own, and would need a white man to guide them into the new world. Thus, they would see Manson as their master, and he would become the leader of this new world. After listening to the Beatles' White Album, Manson started to refer to the race war as Helter Skelter, believing that the song was speaking to him directly. Following this, Manson killed a rival drug dealer named Bernard Crow, after a member of his group robbed Crow, and they threatened to kill everyone at the ranch. On the 1st of July 1969, Manson shot Crow and later confirmed the murder when the news reports mentioned the discovery of a dumped body, believed to be a member of the Black Panthers. Although Crow was not actually a member of the Black Panthers, Manson anticipated retaliation from the group and consequently hired a biker gang for security. In July, a music teacher who had befriended a member of the Manson family was taken hostage after Charles Manson suspected he was wealthy. Manson sent Susan Atkins, Mary Brunner, and Bobby Basile to Gary Hinman's house to persuade him to join the family and hand over his assets. However, Hinman denied having any money. Manson later arrived and used a sword, slashing Hinman's face and ear. Subsequently, Basile stabbed him to death. Before leaving, they wrote the word "political piggy" on the wall in blood, along with a paw symbol of the Black Panthers. Basile was arrested in August 1969 when he was caught driving Hinman's car. On the 9th of August 1969, the Manson family committed a crime that would cement their infamy and instill fear across the nation. They targeted the home of the actress Sharon Tate. However, this was not the first time a member of the Manson family had encountered Tate. In March of 1969, Charles Manson himself visited her home, searching for a man named Terry Melcher. The occupants informed Manson they didn't know who Melcher was, and he left. Tex Watson claimed that Manson had instructed him to go to the house at 150 Silo Drive, the home of Roman Polanski, and totally destroy everyone there, making it as gruesome as possible. Watkins then took Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian with him, following Manson's orders to do whatever Watson said. On the night of the attack, the household included the following people: Sharon Tate, 26, who was heavily pregnant; Wojciech Flakowski, 32; Abigail Ann Folger, 35, and the heiress to the Folger coffee fortune; Jay Sebring, 35, a famous hairstylist; the 19-year-old caretaker William Garretson; and Stephen Parent, 18, a friend of William's. To prevent anyone from inside the house calling for help, Watson cut the phone lines before the group climbed over the hedge. Once inside, they saw headlights approaching. While the woman hid, Watson ordered the driver to stop and aimed a .22 caliber revolver at him. The driver, Stephen Parent, pled with Watson not to harm him, promising he wouldn't say anything. Despite this, Watson attacked Parent with a knife, injuring him and then shooting him 4 times, killing him as he sat in his car. Watson opened the door to let Atkins and Krenwinkel in, while Kasabian was instructed to keep watch by the gate. Watson accidentally woke Frykowski, who was asleep on the sofa, and in response kicked him in the head. Frykowski, startled, asked, "Who are you and what are you doing here?" Watson chillingly replied, "I'm the devil, and I'm here to do the devil's business." Meanwhile, the other members of the group gathered the remaining occupants of the house and forced them into the front room. Watson then began tying Tate and Sebring together with a rope around their neck. While Sebring protested against the treatment of Tate, Watson shot him and then stabbed him 7 times. Frykowski managed to free himself from his restraints, but Atkins quickly intervened, stabbing him in the leg. Despite this, Frykowski made out the front door and onto the porch. However, Watkins caught up with him, striking him in the head multiple times with a gun before shooting and stabbing him repeatedly. Kasabian attempted to halt the violence by warning Watson that someone was approaching. However, Folger tried to escape, making it to the front yard before being tackled and stabbed by Krenwinkel. Watson assisted in killing her, resulting in a total of 28 stab wounds. Frykowski, still struggling across the lawn, was ultimately killed by Watson. He suffered 15 total wounds and was struck in the head 13 times with Watson's gun. Tate pled with the attackers to keep her hostage until she gave birth, hoping to protect her unborn child. The attackers, being the monstrous individuals they were, stabbed Tate 17 times, leading to her death. Atkins then wrote the word pig on the front door, using Tate's blood. This was done to mimic the other murder scene at Hinman's in an attempt to get Bossele out of jail, and to follow Manson's orders to leave a sign of something witchy. The day after the murder of Tate, Manson went for a drive with Tate's attackers and some other members of the family. It's alleged that Manson was disappointed with the previous night's murders. He instructed Kasabian to drive to a house located at 3301 Waverly Drive in the Los Feliz area of LA. They arrived at the house of supermarket executive Leon Lebionka and his wife Rosemary Lebionka. From here there are conflicting accounts, so let's discuss each one separately. Atkins and Kasabian claimed that Manson went up the driveway alone and later returned saying that he had tied up the house's occupants and that they should not come up to the house with him. However, Watson claimed that Manson went to the house alone, later returning to take him with him to the house, where they would enter through an unlocked back door. Manson woke up the sleeping Lino Lebionka at gunpoint and bound his hands. Rosemary was brought into the living room and both had their heads covered with pillowcases and were bound in place with a lamp cord. Manson then left and Krenwinkel and Van Houten entered. Watson sent the women to the bedroom with Rosemary, while he went into the living room and attacked Lino with a chrome-plated bayonet. After attacking Lino, he went to the bedroom after hearing a commotion, where he found Rosemary swinging a lamp to keep her attackers at bay. Watson stabbed her several times before returning to attack Lino again, stabbing him 12 times in total and carving the word war into his abdomen. Krenwinkel and Van Houten stabbed Rosemary 41 more times, many of the wounds inflicted after she was already dead. Watson then took a shower and cleaned the murder weapon, while Krenwinkel wrote "Death to Pigs" and "Rise" on the wall, along with the words "Helter Skelter" on the refrigerator door, all in Lebionka's blood. On the 26th of August 1969, a Hollywood stuntman named Donald Jerome Shorty Shea was murdered by the Manson family. The murder was carried out after Manson instructed Shea, Bruce Davis, Tex Watson, and Stephen Gorgon to go for a ride to a nearby car park close to Span Ranch. Davis claims that Shea was hit with a pipe wrench while he was stabbed by Watson, then brought down a hill before being stabbed again and tortured until he passed away. Bruce Davis said the following at a parole hearing: "I was in the car when Steve hit Shorty with a pipe wrench. Watson stabbed him. I was in the back seat with Gorgon. They took Shorty out. They had to go down a hill to a place. I stayed in the car for quite a while. Then I went down the hill. Later on, and that's when I cut Shorty on the shoulder with a knife. After he was, well, I don't know. I don't know if he was dead or not. He didn't bleed when I cut him on the shoulder. When I showed up, he was incapacitated. I don't know if you ask if he was unconscious. I don't know. He may or may not have been. He didn't seem conscious. He wasn't moving or saying anything. And it started off, Manson handed me a match, as if I was supposed to, I know what he wanted. But I couldn't do that. And I in fact did touch Shorty Shea with a machete on the back of his neck. Didn't break the skin. I just couldn't do it. And then I threw the knife, and he handed me a bayonet. And I just reached out and, I don't know what side it was on, but I cut him right about here, on the shoulder, just with the tip of the blade. So are you satisfied, Charlie? I turned around and walked away, and I was sick for about 2 to 3 days. I couldn't even think about what I had done. In December 1977, Shea's remains were discovered after Gorgon arranged to assist the authorities in recovering Shea's body. He provided a drawn indication of the location of the remains, which he handed over to the authorities. On August 9th, the Tate murders became national news after being discovered by Winfred Chapman, the housekeeper for the Polanski residence. When the police arrived at 150 Celia Drive, they were horrified by the brutality of the killings carried out by the Manson family. The officers quickly moved from securing the scene to trying to catch those who were responsible as soon as possible. However, in the haste, some protocols were not followed. The arriving officers used sheets from the owner's linen cupboard, leading to contamination of the victims. It's said that the sheet used to cover Abigail Folger was still there a week after the investigation began. Vincent Bogliosi wrote in his book Helter Skelter about the LAPD officer DeRosa, who, while escorting a suspect down the drive, pressed the electronic button to open the gate. This action destroyed any other fingerprints that might have been there. After examining all the evidence, the LAPD developed several theories about how the events of the night unfolded. The first theory was close to the actual events, suggesting that the killer climbed a telephone pole to cut the phone lines before entering the property and killing the first victim, Stephen Parent, who had witnessed the killers entering the grounds. It was theorized that the killer was hired to kill the residents, though the reason for this was unclear. The second theory proposed that the killer went to the house around midnight to deliver narcotics, but an argument broke out leading to the murder of the house's occupants and any witnesses. The phone line was then cut to delay anyone from contacting help, aiding in the covering up of the crime. The final theory was that the suspect intended to commit a robbery, but a fight broke out once they entered the house, resulting in the occupants being killed. The criminal then killed any witnesses and cut the phone lines to increase the time before the crime would be discovered. These theories do not account for the writing left behind by the family, or why they would go through the effort of tying up the victims and hanging tape by the neck. It's unclear why someone involved in a robbery would want to do such a thing when they'd want to leave as quickly as possible. The LA County Sheriff's Department, who had been investigating the Hinman case, worked with the LAPD due to the similarities in the case, such as the bloody writing left by the killers. However, because detectives believed that the Tate murders were connected to drug transactions, the similarity between the cases were not initially linked. Tate's autopsy revealed some information to the detectives working on the Hinman case, such as the use of a similar weapon to create the stab wounds on Tate's body. However, due to Vince Bugliosi not considering the Hinman case worth prosecuting, the connections were not made immediately. Tate's autopsies occurred before the LaBianca bodies were discovered, so the connection between the two cases was not made for some time. The LaBianca murders were not discovered until 20 hours after they were committed by the Manson family, on August 10, 1969. Rosemary's son, from a previous marriage, arrived at the house and felt something was off, after seeing that the curtains were drawn and the car still had the speedboat attached. Rosemary's son Frank called his sister and her boyfriend to help him check out the house. After finding Lena's body, they called the police, who then found Rosemary's body. For the suspect in the Tate murder, the police initially suspected someone who was familiar with the property and had connections to Tate. They found a link to William Garretson, the caretaker who was living in the guest house at the time. Garretson underwent a polygraph test and was later released after telling the police he had not seen anything on the night of the murders. On the 12th of August, the LAPD announced to the press that there was no connection between the LaBianca and Tate cases. Shortly after this, they raided Span Ranch, arresting Charles Manson and 25 others on suspicion of car theft. These cars were being stolen and converted into dune buggies. However, due to a warrant error, the group was released a few days later. Meanwhile, these car thefts had occurred at a different ranch near Death Valley, while the Manson family members were searching for a bottomless pit to hide in during the anticipated race war. The Manson family was arrested again at the ranch after detectives from the LaBianca case collaborated with those working on the Hinman case. They had learned from Bussolet's girlfriend, who had been arrested in the previous raid, that the family was involved in more serious crimes. The investigation into the Manson family was ultimately triggered by evidence left behind after they burned some building machinery owned by the Death Valley Monument. On the 16th of August 1969, a raid resulted in the arrest of 24 people, with Manson found hiding in a cupboard under the sink. Despite his arrest, the authorities were unaware that they had apprehended more than just car thieves. During this period, detectives on the LaBianca case found leads that helped narrow down suspects. They contacted members of the biker gang Manson had hired to be his bodyguards. Susan Atkins, a Manson family member, was already in jail after confessing to her involvement in the crimes. With this information, the LAPD issued an arrest warrant on the 1st of December for Watkins, Krenwinkel, and Kasabian as suspects in the murder case. These individuals had not been arrested in the initial raid. Van Houten, who was also in custody, was not yet linked to the case. Watson and Krenwinkel were already in custody in Texas, and Kasabian surrendered to the police in Concord, New Hampshire, the next day. With the Manson family behind bars, the investigators found it easy to piece together the evidence from the Tate murders. In September, a 10-year-old boy living near the Tate residence handed in a .22 caliber high-standard bunt special revolver used by Watson during the crimes. Only the knife used by Atkins had been recovered. The other knives were not found. In mid-December, a local news crew discovered bloody clothes belonging to the killers. With this evidence, fingerprints were taken from the Manson family and matched those found at the crime scene, further solidifying the case against them. Six months later, in June 1970, the trial of Charles Manson began. Manson, alongside Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian, faced 7 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy. Initially, a deal was struck with Atkins. She would avoid the death penalty in exchange for her testimony detailing the murders. However, Atkins later refused to testify, leading to the withdrawal of this offer. Kasabian, who has not participated in the actual killings, was granted immunity in return for her detailed account of the night's events and her testimony. Leslie Van Houten, not involved in the Tate murders, was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 count of conspiracy. Manson initially wanted to represent himself, a request granted by Judge William Keene. However, after Manson violated a gag order and submitted a series of bizarre pre-trial motions, this permission was revoked before the trial began. Manson then filed an affidavit of prejudice against Keene, leading to his replacement by Judge Charles Alder. On Friday 24th of July, the first day of the trial commenced. Manson appeared in court with an X carved into his forehead, and later shaved his head. He did this in protest of not being allowed to represent himself, stating he was considered inadequate and incompetent to speak or defend himself, and that he had X'd himself from the world. During the trial, Manson demonstrated his control over his followers. At one point he turned his back on the judge and refused to turn around, prompting his followers to do the same, and copy the X on his forehead. Manson also had outbursts, which his followers would chant rhythmically, sometimes in Latin. At one point during the trial, Manson attacked the judge after being told to be quiet due to his rambling. From here, this is what Manson said. "The moment I see you are going to kill me, do you know what I'm going to do? What are you going to do? I'm going to have you removed, Mr. Manson, if you don't stop. I'm going to have you removed, if you don't stop. I have a little system of my own." From here, Manson would jump headfirst from the defense tower at the judge's bench, leading to a police officer throwing himself across the table to subdue Manson. This led to Manson yelling, "You think I'm kidding? In the name of Christian justice, someone should cut off your head." This led to Manson being removed from the courtroom. The prosecution argued that the events from the crime scene, such as the writing of Helter Skelter and Pigs, combined with Manson's predictions about a race war, indicated the triggering of Helter Skelter was Manson's main motivation. The defense countered that the writing on the wall were a copy of the Hinman murders, and not indicative of the apocalyptic race war. According to prosecutor Vince Bogliosi, Kasabian was instructed by Manson to hide a wallet taken from the scene of the crime, and place it in a bathroom located in a black neighborhood. However, Kasabian left the wallet in a white neighborhood instead. Other members of the Manson family did their best to cause disruptions during the trial. They loitered near and inside the courthouse, but were unable to enter the courtroom as they were subpoenaed as possible witnesses, preventing them from being present while others testified. These members also carved X's on their foreheads, making them easily identifiable. These members also attempted to intimidate witnesses from testifying against Manson. Paul Watkins and Joanne Flynn were both threatened. Watkins had been badly burned in a fire that occurred in his van, which was believed to have been started by the family members. It's unclear why a potential witness was unguarded, given the high profile of the case. Police incompetence is often seen in cases involving killers and cults. The family also targeted another member, Barbara Hoyt, who was initially reluctant to be a witness. After taking a trip to Hawaii with Ruth Ann Morehouse, Hoyt was allegedly given a burger spiked with a large amount of LSD. She was found on the side of the road in Honolulu in a drug-induced stupor, but managed to get to a hospital where she identified herself as a witness in the Manson case. This led to her becoming a witness. Manson managed to sneak a newspaper into the courthouse and flash it to the jury on the 4th of August. The paper was a copy of the LA Times with the headline, "Manson Guilty, Nixon Declares." President Nixon, who believed the media was glamorizing Manson, was critical of the free love movement, viewing it as a threat to the American society. Nixon might have seen Manson's actions as a way to discredit the movement and bring an end to the hippie culture. However, the jury mandated that the headline did not influence their decision. The following day, the female members of the jury stood up and declared that the trial was now pointless due to the president's remarks. Let's discuss an interesting twist in the case. I only discovered this while researching for the Manson topic recently. On the 16th of November, the prosecution rested its case and awaited the defense to present its witnesses. However, the defense chose to not call any witnesses and instead rest its case as well. This prompted Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten to demand their right to testify. The lawyer informed the judge that the client wanted to testify and that they had planned and committed the crimes without Manson's knowledge or involvement. The defense lawyer opposed this and rested their case. This is when Van Houten's attorney, Ronald Hughes, stated he would not push a client out the window. It was believed at the time that Manson was orchestrating the proceedings, convincing the women to testify in this manner. In a 1987 interview with Krenwinkel, she said the following: "The entire process was scripted by Manson, highlighting his control over the family." So why is Ronald Hughes interesting? Hughes had experience with the counterculture of the time, especially in Southern California. He had earned the nickname the hippie lawyer and did not have the typical appearance of a lawyer, sporting a great big bushy beard. Due to Hughes' attempts to stop the girls from testifying, Manson despised him, stating he never wanted to see him in the courtroom again. During a 2-week recess, Hughes embarked on a trip to a remote area near Sespe Hot Springs in Ventura County, California. He was accompanied by 2 friends, James Forsher and Lauren Elder. According to them, the weather during the trip was poor, with heavy rainfall causing a flash flood that led their vehicle getting stuck in the mud. This led Forsher and Elder to hitchhike out of the area, while Hughes remained until the 29th of November. Due to increased rainfall, an evacuation was necessary. Hughes was last seen on the morning of the 28th by some campers. They noted that he was alone, appeared unharmed, and stopped to chat with them. However, when court resumed on the 30th, Hughes failed to appear. Consequently, the Ventura County Sheriff's Department launched an investigation. But they had to wait for the bad weather to clear, delaying the start of their search by 2 days. At this time, a new attorney was appointed to the women, who protested and demanded that their lawyer be dismissed and the defense reopened. Her requests were denied. By the end of the week, Hughes had been missing for 2 whole weeks. This led Manson to claim that the judge had done away with Hughes, resulting in Manson and the women being removed from the courtroom. The police searched for Hughes more than a dozen times but couldn't find him, and he was likely presumed dead. In March 1971, police received a tip and searched an area where the Manson family used to live, in Inyo County. Eerily, Hughes' body was discovered by 2 fishermen stuffed between 2 rocks in a gorge. This was on the same day, 29th of March 1971, that the defendants were given the death penalty. Hughes was ultimately identified by his dental records. The theory suggests that a member of the Manson family went to the same area as Hughes, killed him before hiding his body. We don't know how Hughes died, or if foul play was involved. However, retired police officer Charles Rudd investigated the case and believed that there was no foul play. He concluded that Hinman was killed by a falling rock and then drowned. Personally, I don't subscribe to the foul play theory either. It would have been much easier for Manson's followers to deal with Hinman when he was back in town. In my opinion, going to the same area as Hughes without being seen would have been difficult. Let's get back to Manson. The following day, on the 17th of November, Manson was back in the courtroom to testify. However, before he could begin, Prosecutor Bogliosi had the judge removed to avoid violating the People v. Aranda ruling. This ruling addressed the risk of defendants being unfairly convicted based on statements made by co-defendants. This was a concern because Manson could potentially say things that might negatively influence the judge's perception of the women involved. Manson then rambled on for quite some time, stating, "To be honest with you, I don't recall ever saying, get a knife and a change of clothes and go do what text says." As soon as the trial resumed, the defendants caused further disruptions, prompting the judge to ban them from the courtroom for the rest of the guilt phase. The guilt phase is a legal procedure that allows the judge to split the trial into 2 parts, enabling them to evaluate different aspects of the case separately to reach a verdict. There was a break over the Christmas period, during which I couldn't find out much about what happened to Manson. However, I imagine he received a big lump of coal from Old St. Nick. The jury reconvened on the 25th of January 1971 to deliver a guilty verdict against the defendants on each of the 27 separate counts against them. Manson's planned defense was as followed. The woman involved would testify that the murders had been conceived as a copy of the murders that happened at Hinman's place, with the goal of diverting attention from another family member, Bobby Beausoleil, who was currently in jail for those crimes. According to Linda Sabian, the crimes were carried out by someone associated with Beausoleil and not Manson. However, there was an issue with the defense. If this was the plan, why did Atkins write political piggy on the wall of Hinman's house? During this period, Manson continued to demonstrate his control over the women in the family. After shaving his head and shaping his beard into a point, he proclaimed to the press, "I'm the devil, and the devil always has a bald head." After the jurors retired to deliberate on the verdict, the women also shaved their heads. The attempt to exonerate Manson for the murders ultimately failed. On the 29th of March 1971, the jury returned a verdict of death against the defendants on all counts, a decision the judge concurred with on the 19th of April. For those who have been following closely, you might have noticed that Tex Watson wasn't predominantly mentioned during the bulk of the Manson trial. He was later arrested in Texas on the 30th of November 1969, following a tip from California police that his fingerprints matched those found at the scene of the Tate murders. Watson's trial began in August 1971, and by October, he had also been found guilty of murder. Watson, like the others, was sentenced to death. With his sentencing, all members of the Manson family involved in the killing have received the death penalty. Later, California abolished the death penalty, sparing Manson and his followers from execution, but leaving them behind bars. However, even in prison, Manson had one more moment of infamy. Family member Squeaky Foreman attempted to assassinate US President Gerald Ford, thrusting Manson back into the headlines. Charles Manson would ultimately die of a heart attack on the 19th of November 2017. Although Manson was not solely responsible for the demise of the counterculture movement of the 1960s, his family's actions undeniably tarnished much of the good that the movement sought to achieve. Manson's own delusions, fueled by drugs, led to the death and destruction of many lives, and instigated fear throughout California. He was not a prophet sent by God to build a new world, but a con man much like his father. Obsessed with power and control, he exploited his followers' weaknesses for his own gain and amusement. Despite all the harm Manson caused, he remains a topic of discussion to this day, and the stain he left on the 1960s is one that can never be erased. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and leave a comment down below. Thanks for watching. Bye!